This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society, and of course we explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who actually live them. We bring the best and brightest to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. United States Surgeon General Vivek Murthy recently issued a new advisory on parental stress. His report's getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. As our guest this morning has noted, many parents can relate to its argument that parenting today seems more stressful than ever and that something needs to change to make raising a family easier. Those are the words of Brad Wilcox, a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies marital quality, marital stability, and the impact of strong and stable marriages on women, men, and children. He's the author of numerous books and extraordinary research on marriage and family. His latest book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. This week, he wrote a piece for Deseret.com on the reason why the Surgeon General's dour picture of parenthood misses the mark. Brad, welcome back to Sunday Edition. Great to have you back on.
It's great to be here with you today, Boyd.
So let's start with the Surgeon General report. It was pretty dour and pretty down in terms of what's happening there and what is taking place. Give us your sense in the report itself.
Yeah, so Boyd, there's obviously some good things about the report. He does call parenting a kind of sacred undertaking. He does, I think, acknowledge that all of us are struggling today to help kind of deal with the technology issue with our teenagers, and that, the kind of technology stresses that we face, I think, can be, uniquely challenging for us. I think it's also the case that there are lots of families out there who are struggling when it comes to affording the basic costs of rearing the next generation, especially, I think, housing today. So there are some, I think, legitimate kind of concerns that the Surgeon General is raising. The problem, though, is that the portrait he paints is needlessly dark and dour. It's all about how parents are lonely and they're anxious and they're stressed and they're depressed. And there's kind of no recognition in the report that there are many, many positives that we see in the data when it comes to parenthood today in the U.S.
So as you look at that, it often is in reports like this, it's not necessarily what is said, but what is left out, what is not said that often screams and, as you pointed out, kind of pours gasoline on a lot of young people today who might be a little fearful and a little apprehensive of getting married or having children in the first place. Kind of play that out for us.
Yeah, so we are seeing, Boyd, more and more young adults, particularly younger women, who are expressing concerns about marriage and motherhood, and then just more generally for young men as well about becoming parents. And I think that makes sense in a context where a lot of the messaging that they're getting from social media, from the mainstream media, from some folks in their community, and now from the Surgeon General, again, is kind of painting a really negative portrait of parenthood as, super stressful and hard these days. And I don't want to minimize the challenges of parenting. And I acknowledge that there were moments in my life as a parent when I was super stressed out as well. But in general, Boy, what we're seeing is that parents today report that their lives are more meaningful. Parents today report that their lives are less lonely. And then parents today report that they're happier compared to their childless peers. And I think, that makes sense in a context, when you're a parent, you have someone else or a bunch of other someone else's who love you, who are concerned about you, and who you are caring for. And as Aristotle said, we are social animals. And for both women and for men, I think having the opportunity to both be cared for by others and to care for others in an incredibly meaningful way as moms and dads ends up being, both meaningful and, much of the time, happiness inducing. And that kind of more positive, but more balanced, I think, portrait of parenthood is not expressed in the Surgeon General's new advisory.
Yeah, we always say that Marriage is not for wimps, and families are messy. Parenting is challenging. And so as you look at the realities of that, because this is not about a Pollyanna approach that everything is good. Some families are really hard. Broken families are real. Single parent families are difficult. But there's also so much of that rewarding. Just unpack that a little bit in terms of what some of your research and data is showing in terms of that happiness factor, that contentment that seems to be connected to parenting and family.
Yeah, let me say two things, one about meaning and one about happiness. And the point about meaning comes through in some research by the psychologist Paul Bloom. And what he actually finds is that, yeah, if you're kind of super stressed out, all the time, suffering all the time, that's terrible. But if you've got no stress in your life, no suffering in your life, and if your life is kind of meaningless, if you're just kind of like living just to be happy in the moment, that's not a really meaningful life, and that's not really good for us. And so what he finds in his research is that parents often experience stress and some suffering as parents. But that's actually good, especially when it's attached to kind of a meaningful activity like being a mom and being a dad. And so, those late nights at times, helping kids with homework, dragging your kids on a long hike on a Sunday afternoon, these things can be tough, no doubt. But, these things also kind of endow our lives with a sense of meaning that's, ends up being really important and valuable kind of long term. And then on the happiness side, there's just no question that, opportunities to care for your kids, to kind of teach them how to swim. When you get to the end of the hike, for instance, with your kids, these things, give most of us as parents a lot of happiness. And this kind of came through for me just personally. I was driving my kids to Catholic school one morning, texting my wife with some kind of, pedestrian, thing. And at the end of the sort of voice to text, message to my wife, my youngest son jumped in from the back seat and said, "I love you. I love you. I love you," 3 times to my wife. And I'm sure that kind of gave her, a unique sense of happiness, kind of starting off her workday, there with this message that she knew was from her youngest son.
Fantastic. We're going to stay with the question and the conversation with Brad Wilcox when Sunday Edition continues here on KSL 5 TV. We'll be right back. We're staying with the question and the conversation with Brad Wilcox, director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia and author of Get Married, an extraordinary book. You want to pick that one up and check that out. Brad, as we continue the conversation, one of the things that you and I have been going back and forth on is just how the media in particular portrays family and parenting, and how, while they often want the positive results from all of that, they seem to be mocking what happens in the middle to actually make it a reality.
Yeah, Boyd, I think we're kind of seeing 2 different sets of messages from the media. I mean, sometimes they're just downright, negative about marriage and parenthood, entirely. There was a piece in the New York Times, for instance, that said that married motherhood in America is a game no one wins. So a pretty negative message about marriage and motherhood. And then when they're kind of speaking more broadly, they often kind of will take, shots at religious institutions, for instance, kind of, highlighting people who have left a particular tradition, are unhappy with the tradition, or even, realistic failings that different traditions have. I'm Catholic and certainly can appreciate that there are ways in which the church has failed people, and that's just part and parcel of, I think, really any community. But what they're, I think, often overlooking, Boyd, is the way in which, in general and on average, American churches tend to help people. What I see in the piece that I wrote for Deseret, for instance, is that religious parents, are about a third more likely to be, happy with their lives compared to other Americans. And so there's just a way in which I also see in other work too that there's just a lot of positive connections between kind of practicing your faith and having a strong family life, in the data. And that kind of story is generally not told in today's mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, and that interesting combination between marriage and parenting and faith and community is really one that we often end up looking to Washington or looking to government to solve problems. And we know that having government as family and parenting is a failed experiment. But what should we be doing? What is the proper role in terms of government, community, faith institutions in really supporting and maybe lessening some of the stress of parenting, but enabling everyone to do it a little bit better?
So I think the mistake that many advocates of strong family policies make, especially on the left, is kind of to think about the government as a replacement for parents. They want to kind of have a pretty intrusive role for government in our schools and in sort of therapeutic interventions that kind of really intervene pretty heavily in the fabric of family life. And I think what we would do better when it comes to public policies to recognize and realize it's more about kind of getting the incentives right, especially financially. So trying to figure out ways to make housing, especially single-family housing, more affordable for working middle-class families, giving parents more choices when it comes to how they want to school their kids and also how they want to care for their young children with things like vouchers and child allowances. So that's, I think, where government can be helpful, but recognizing that kind of the most important institutions, for our kids tend to be kin and churches and other local community institutions that kind of are more, on the ground and have a better sense of how people, can thrive. And so when it comes to churches, for instance, I think doing more on the family ministry front, to give couples and parents advice and counsel, hints about how they can do things better, but also to kind of do things like, date nights that make it, more enjoyable when it comes to, married life and family life. These are the kinds of measures and approaches that we should be highlighting and encouraging for our churches across the U.S.
Finally, Brad, before we let you go, give us a sense, kind of in a compare and contrast. Obviously, what has come out from the Surgeon General, again, pretty dour. Give us something that maybe surprised you or something from your research that's sort of a compare and contrast that might get us to think again about what we think we know when it comes to parenting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what is kind of striking is that we often hear people complaining on social media and mainstream media about how difficult and challenging parenting is. And yet we don't, I think, really appreciate how much we thrive, both women actually and men. It's important to kind of stress that latter point, when we have opportunities to care for others, to be generous towards others. And for many of us, I think that's kind of most likely to be realized, in the home. With our spouse and kids. And so kind of just underline the importance of kind of the virtue of generosity, thinking about small ways you can kind of serve your wife, your husband, and your kids. And just being more intentional about, that generosity is linked in my own research to a lot of good outcomes. So I think just kind of, stressing the importance of looking for opportunities to do those small acts of generosity that just underline how much you care for your wife, your husband, and for your children. It's kind of an important reminder we need, I think, to have on an almost daily basis. And there's lots of science to tell us that leads to good outcomes, not just for our families, but even for us as individuals, generally speaking.
Yeah. And as you look at the data, give us just one data point that might be a little surprising to us in terms of that satisfaction. Stress exists for sure, but what do the numbers tell us, just bottom line, in terms of why parenting is something we all ought to be thinking about pursuing or doing better?
Yeah, so in the piece that I just did for the Deseret News, what I found in that piece, for instance, is that what we're seeing in my research is that just another data point is that conservatives today, 33% of them who are parents are very happy with parenthood, compared to just 22% of liberal parents. It kind of just gives you one more data point that's kind of surprising. And I think both, again, religious parents and conservative parents, not always the same thing, tend to invest more meaning in family life and tend to get more support from their social networks. And that helps make the whole parenting endeavor that much easier.
Fantastic. Brad Wilcox, always appreciate our conversations. Thanks so much for joining us today. When we come back, we'll explore the swamp of Washington, D.C. and the unlikely lessons it holds as we assess candidates and chart a way forward for our nation during a contentious 2024 election cycle. Stay with us. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. Our nation's capital is regularly referred to as the swamp, both for the hot and humid conditions along the Potomac River that prevail there, but also for some of the people who barter and sell, amass, and wield power there. Some time ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for meetings and media appearances and was reminded of the bad, the ugly, and even the good from that place. Going to our nation's capital, especially in the summertime, is always an adventure. The weather is sweltering, and the influx of summer tourists makes traveling and moving in and around the city challenging, even exasperating. Yet there are always lessons to be learned, wonderful people to meet, and a sense of history to recognize and remember. Yes, the swamp still matters and has meaning. Now, the angst and frustration looming over our capital city is often palpable. The partisan divide is ever evident in the instant certainty with which political operatives, partisan lobbyists, and social media influencers spew their interpretations of what a particular politician or political party did or didn't say, what it means for a current president or those running for president or members of Congress. Noticeable by its absence in the contempt-fueled political rhetoric is any reference to what these seemingly endless political battles actually mean or what they'll do for the American people and the people of the world. Now, it's easy to buy into the mood and become mired in the malaise and flustered and frustrated with all that's wrong in Washington, D.C., but I found that simply walking out of the Capitol onto the National Mall changes everything. Very few of the tourists there are focused on or even aware of the partisan battles raging on Capitol Hill. They're focused on other things, the positive lessons of the swamp. In the midst of such summers in the swamp of D.C., I've witnessed thousands and thousands of people from all around the world coming to this awful, hot, humid place. Visitors from Taiwan and South Africa, the nations of Europe and South America, and from every state of the Union. These people clearly don't come for the weather. They don't come to see members of Congress. They don't come for the food. They don't even come for our historic buildings, which by comparison with those in Asia or Europe aren't all that old or even that impressive. I have often asked myself why. Why do millions of people come every year to Washington and walk around this sweltering swamp in a kind of quiet reverence, speaking in hushed tones with eyes filled with wonder and awe? The answer, of course, is that the people come because this patch of swamp on the Potomac is a place where the principles of freedom, liberty, and opportunity loom large. And people come just for the chance to experience such principles for themselves, or to ensure that their children or grandchildren know why this place and this nation matter. The swamp always surprises me. I always learn something when I visit, often from unexpected places and people. I once traveled to D.C. to attend meetings of the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce, including White House briefings on trade and immigration issues. The focus in these meetings was finding common ground and solutions that would bless the lives of citizens in both of these countries. I attended a dinner honoring those leaders from Mexico and America who've been good neighbors in promoting peace and prosperity, understanding and cooperation. Interestingly and instructively, the dinner began with a Jewish rabbi offering a thought and a prayer. He quoted Simeon ben Zoma, who asked and answered, "Who is wise? One who learns from all people. Who is strong? One who conquers his negative inclination. Who is rich? One who is happy with what he has. Who is honorable? One who honors all of mankind." These are clearly messages consistent with the founding of the nation. Messages from the swamp come in many forms. I would not have guessed I would have learned such wisdom from a Jewish rabbi while attending a U.S.-Mexico business meeting. Members of Congress, their staff, media, and others who work in our capital would do well to think about such principles and then apply them as a way to truly drain the swamp. So as the 2024 political season accelerates into hyperdrive, and as you learn about and listen to those you're seeking to vote for in office, as local city officials, state legislators, governors, members of Congress, and even President of the nation, consider these swamp draining principles. First, who is wise? One who learns from all people. So ask yourself, does this candidate learn from others? Do they possess radical curiosity? Are they willing to ask great questions and truly listen, especially to those they disagree with? Are they willing to learn from others, even if they have to admit they were wrong? Wisdom in leadership comes not only from deploying 2 ears, but also possessing a listening and learning heart. Second, who is strong? One who conquers his negative inclination. Ask yourself, does this candidate demonstrate and show restraint in their words and actions? Just because you can say something doesn't mean you should. Just because you can do something because you have the power doesn't mean you should. Just as with military weapons, the greatest power is not that you have them, it's in your ability to show restraint and not use them. Leaders usually don't fail for lack of talent or ability. They fail because their weaknesses, those negative inclinations, become the dominant force in their behavior. Third, who is rich? One who is happy with what he has. So ask yourself, is this candidate content to do the job they're running for? Or are they looking for whatever is next in their climb to power and their drive to amass fame and fortune? Far too many are more interested in popularity and power than they are in governing and doing the job they were elected to do. If a politician is spending their time obsessed with social media likes and clicks, national TV appearances, and fundraising, they might make themselves wealthy, but they will not create the true riches of stronger citizens and a better, happier community. Fourth, who is honorable? One who honors all. Ask yourself, how does this candidate talk about others, including their opponents and those they disagree with? Do they talk about those who are struggling in society as liabilities to be managed, or as human beings filled with infinite, even divine potential to be nurtured? Do they respect those that have sacrificed to serve, those who have gone before, and those who are not in the room to defend themselves? Does the candidate inspire the best that is within each citizen, or play to the negative base emotions of anger and angst, fear, frustration, contempt, and caustic hate? Honoring all of mankind includes those who look and live, believe, and behave differently than we do. In our pluralistic society, oneness and unity does not mean sameness, and that's to be celebrated and honored and sought for in those we elect. So from now until Election Day on the first Tuesday of November, we will hear countless politicians from across the political spectrum invoke a promise to drain the swamp. Now, it'd be wonderful if we could drain the swamp of those who put personal power and profit ahead of principle and good policy. But draining power brokers and influence peddlers, I think, would do wonders. While such promises are easily made and make for great applause lines and bumper stickers for political campaigns, they have nothing to do and have done nothing to transform the broken elements of our politics. So perhaps rather than draining the D.C. swamp, we should simply reinfuse it with the principles that are chiseled in granite in every monument and marbled hall on the National Mall. So despite all our faults and failings as a nation, in our politics, rhetoric, and behavior, the principles found and infused in Washington still ring out and ring true as freedom's last best hope on earth. The nation's capital is, at its best, a place for people of all ages and from every land to experience principles and the hope for freedom that naturally burns in every human heart. So the swamp still matters and has meaning, not because of the people who work there or the power deployed there, but because of the principles that are enshrined there. And it matters for millions who flock there from the four corners of the earth just for the opportunity to see, feel, and experience it for themselves. Well, that wraps it up for us here on Sunday Edition. I'm Boyd Matheson. Thanks for joining us. And as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.